Welcome to the finale of our 2 days together. Before we start, I just wanted to mention one thing, and that is getting a group together of this size and as unruly as this group is, takes a lot of work, and our foundation team, institute team, has been working for months to put this together. And please join me, if you would, in expressing our appreciation for the great work that they've done. Well, as we begin the finale of our program today, I would like to quote from President Reagan's D-Day remarks. He said, quote, "We are bound today by what bound us 40 years ago, the same loyalties, traditions, and beliefs. We're bound by reality. The strength of America's allies is vital to the United States, and the American security guarantee is essential to the continued freedom of Europe's democracies. We were with you then, we are with you now. Your hopes are our hopes, and your destiny is our destiny." Well, that message from President Reagan should ring true now, just as it did 40 years ago. Our security and strength of our democracy is tied to the strength and security of our democratic allies in Europe and around the world. Our freedoms are inextricably linked. President Reagan understood that. The question today is whether those who wish to lead our country into the future understand that. A diplomat and scholar who early in her career became an expert on the Soviet Union, Dr. Condoleezza Rice, our 66th Secretary of State, understands well that democracy can never be taken for granted. As she so thoughtfully stated here at the Reagan Library a little over a year ago, standing with our allies is, quote, "not only a matter of justice, it's a matter of protecting our interests. Great power rivalry has reemerged with a vengeance." Well, great power rivalry was the defining foreign policy challenge of the Reagan era, and it will likely be the defining issue of this generation as well. So what can we learn from President Reagan's example? What can we learn from the lessons of World War II and D-Day? How do we protect our democracy and prevent global war? We're honored to have the opportunity to ask these questions and more of Secretary Rice. There are many ways to describe her. She's the head of Stanford's Hoover Institution. She's a professor at Stanford Business School, the author of numerous books, a respected voice on geopolitics, a former national security advisor to the president, a classically trained pianist, an elegant ice skater, a superb golfer, part owner of the Denver Broncos. But most of all, we like to refer her and welcome her as trustee of the Reagan Presidential Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Condoleezza Rice. Welcome, Connie.
Thank you.
Here, speak you over here. Welcome back, Dr. Rice. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. And of course, Fred, it's Condi, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've had 2 days of great discussions about President Reagan, and today the focus has been on the 80th anniversary of D-Day.
Yes.
And I thought maybe we could start off just by asking you, here we are on the 80th anniversary of that momentous occasion, and what thoughts come to your mind?
Well, I was at the 60th anniversary of D-Day at Normandy with President George W. Bush. And there were a couple of things that were so extraordinary about it. I'm just so glad that we do these celebrations of it every 10 years or so. The first was the extraordinary sacrifice that these young people from the farms of the United States, from the cities of the United States, young people who wouldn't have been able to do a long dissertation on global politics, but they understood that this was an important place to sacrifice in order to secure freedom. And it's very touching because there in Normandy, there are so many commemorations of that sacrifice. And I think it shows us what can happen when democratic allies bind together against what must have seemed at the time insurmountable odds. And we just need to be constantly reminded, you know, the reason that you do anniversaries or you do these commemorations is, first of all, to memorialize and to appreciate those who sacrificed, but also to take inspiration from them for your part to be played. And so I remember that extremely well. Normandy is, to my mind, quite a sacred place for democracy.
Right. Well, when you talk about sacrifice, back during the war, people enlisted and went to serve at unprecedented numbers. And it caused our victory. Do you think today that we have the national will to respond in the same way that this generation did at that time?
I may be someone who is more optimistic about the answer to that question than much of what you'll hear these days. First of all, let's remember that after September 11th, 2001, men and women responded. They went into the armed forces. They became officers in the armed forces. It's another kind of greatest generation was born. And so when called, Americans respond. The other point that I'll make is that I'm quite aware that there are all of these polls about Americans not wanting to be involved in the world, and you can understand. We've endured 80 years or more of carrying the burdens in many ways of the world, carrying the burdens of democracy. And I sometimes hear it, well, haven't we done enough? Didn't we defeat the Soviet Union? Didn't we defeat Al-Qaeda? Didn't we unify Germany? We liberated Eastern Europe. Can't somebody else do it?
Right.
But then Americans carry another almost contradictory view in their heads. And that is, well, I can't watch a small country being extinguished by its larger neighbor. I can't watch the horrors of Bucha. I can't watch Syrian babies choking on nerve gas. I can't watch people being beheaded on television. And so if no one else will do it, then we'll have to do it. And I think that that DNA is still very much alive in Americans. And all that I would ask of those who would seek to be our leaders is that you appeal to that sense that America's interests and America's values can only be sustained and protected by sustaining and protecting the values of others, and that we cannot consider ourselves Fortress America. Fred, whenever I'm asked this question, I ask Americans just to remember 3 dates. Remember that a war began in Europe in 1914. We thought we could sit it out. And by 1917, it was clear that we couldn't. And we had to enter at greater cost than had we done so in 1914. And then in 1938 to 1939, a war broke out in Europe. And by 1941, we had to be dragged in. And again, at higher costs than had we acted earlier. And then in 2001, we thought the war was out there. And the war was actually in New York and Washington, D.C., and the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania. And so every time we have refused to recognize that we are the only power capable of defending democracy in the way that only we can do it, we've paid a price, and the world has paid a price. And so I just ask us to keep remembering that Fortress America simply doesn't work.
Some of the conversations we've had today have talked a little bit about the world that President Reagan inherited when he became in office January 20th, 1981. The Soviet Union was on the march. The Cold War was raging. Now a new president will take office, be sworn in on the 20th of January next year. Could you compare the world that president will inherit compared to the world Ronald Reagan had?
Well, it is a different world. I'll come back to the fact that I think that the demands of this world are not unlike the demands of the world that Ronald Reagan walked into that Oval Office in January of 1981. But what's different? Well, first of all, great power rivalry of a kind that we've not seen since the end of World War II has reemerged. And while the Soviet Union was quite an adversary, and as President Reagan often said, a sad experiment that had been hoisted on these people, this terrible experiment of communism. The Soviet Union was a military giant, but it was a technological and economic midget. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't very integrated into the international system. At no time was more than 1% of Soviet GDP accounted for in international trade. Now, this time around, we see the emergence of great powers with territorial claims. Vladimir Putin in Russia, his claims against Ukraine really being claims that the Russian Empire cannot exist if there's an independent Ukraine. But that brings him into very close contact with our Article 5 NATO obligations in places like Poland and in Romania and the like. And so it's a different kind of great power conflict in Europe. In the Indo-Pacific, it's a different kind of great power conflict because China is a country of 1.4 billion people that we integrated into the international economy. And so unlike the Soviet Union, we are interwoven in the international economy with China. Look at the number of American businesses that are in China. Look at the degree to which we learned at the time of COVID. Our entire pharmacological supply chain was in China. And so, yet, we have this adversary in China that is a military, technological, and economic competitor of a kind we've not seen before. And then finally, we have regional powers like Iran, also with territorial claims that are very close to ours. And of course, the Chinese territorial claims to restore China, Taiwan, the Philippines, we're seeing. And so again, very direct territorial conflict. We haven't seen that for a while. A second thing is there's a technological revolution underway, and it's a technological arms race, and we'd better win it. Because whatever you think the dangers or the issues are, or maybe the opportunities are with AI or with synthetic biology or opportunities in space, democracies will debate it. We will have investigative reporting. We will have congressional hearings. If something goes wrong, people will be there to discuss. Not an authoritarian regime. And so the safeguards in a democratic regime are absolutely necessary in this technological period. And then finally, I would say that even if the challenge is different, and let me just say one other thing about that, these three that I've mentioned, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, it's not like they get together every Monday morning and say, what are we going to do today to destroy American power in the world? Okay. But they all want to expel the United States from international leadership, and that they have in common. Mm-hmm. And so everything that they do is really aimed at doing exactly that, even if it's not a coordinated effort among them. So that's another challenge. But what did we learn from the Cold War, from Ronald Reagan's extraordinary leadership during the Cold War? Well, we learned several things. The first was peace does come through strength. And here I worry, and you've had some discussions of this, that our defense industrial base is not what it should be, that we can't build ships in the way that we need to, that we're having trouble now meeting the military's having trouble meeting its recruitment and retention targets. And so are we prepared? And what Ronald Reagan did after a period in which the American military had really been in decline, he came in and he built it up. He strengthened it. He said, we cannot have peace through strength unless the American military is strong. We've got to do that again. Do we have the will? Well, I worry when all we're doing is continuing resolutions in Congress that are basically eating the seed corn of our military. So we've got to get that right. Secondly, we've got to realize, as Ronald Reagan did, that values matter.
Yes.
It matters that we have allies who share our values. It matters that Ukrainians are fighting and dying for the values that we stand for too. It matters that in places across the world, people are still trying to get to the United States of America because they want freedom. And so For all of those reasons, we have to reaffirm the importance of values. And then finally, Ronald Reagan in some ways was the culmination, and George H.W. Bush as well, of 40 years of having had an idea that turns out to have been right. Mm-hmm. George Kennan said, we have to deny the Soviet Union the easy course of external expansion until it has to turn to deal with its own internal contradictions. And that's exactly what happened. It had to turn to deal with its own internal contradictions, and it collapsed. China has massive internal contradictions. Russia has massive internal contradictions. Iran is an internal contradiction. Right. And so denying them the external course of expansion is very much our job now, because eventually these autocracies will not last.
Just to come back on one of the points you made on we must win the technological race, how would you say we're doing at this point?
I would say we're doing okay. We're doing okay because there's nobody more innovative and creative than the American people, the American economy. To be fair, I live in Silicon Valley, and technology's always good in Silicon Valley. I'm hoping this time around that we're not just good at the knowledge part, but we're good at the wisdom part, because these are incredibly transformative technologies. Everybody talks about AI right now. In Washington, they've learned to spell AI, but people don't actually really know what it is and what it can do. But one of the things we're doing at the Hoover Institution is we're doing something called the Stanford Emerging Technology Review, and we're working with the scientists, the computer scientists, the bioengineers, about all of the major emerging technologies. And if you think AI is scary, look at synthetic biology. When we had the first seminar on this, Drew Endy, who is a bioengineer, said, the cell is the basic unit of life, and soon we will be able to engineer the cell. Now that got everybody's attention. So why do I say we have to win this race? Well, just do a little thought experiment. What if the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany had won the race for the atomic bomb? We might have lived in a very different world. We cannot allow China to win this race. Now, we have two ways of doing it. One is we can continue to try to stop them from succeeding. And people say, well, unilateral sanctions don't matter. Well, sometimes they do. And actually, the fact that they can't get the NVIDIA chip because of sanctions has meant that they can't do generative AI. Right? So there's that. But ultimately, there are smart people. They've stolen a lot of technology. Right. They've got a lot of people who've studied here and gone back. And so eventually, they're going to be able to do these things. So we have to keep running faster. And here, I want to go to a very Reagan-like idea. Do not let the United States government get in the way of innovation. Right. Because they will not do it well. I don't mean that we may not need regulation, we may not need rules. The private sector with these technologies, and of course this time around this all exists in the private sector, needs to be responsible. But the problem with government regulation is regulators will regulate even if they don't understand what they're regulating. And this time around, we have to be very careful not to cut off our own innovation, because then the Chinese just keep going. The other problem we have, I love our European allies, but all the regulations being done in Europe, where none of the innovation is taking place. And so we need to work with, for instance, the UK, where a lot of the innovation is taking place, to think about what's sensible and with a light hand. Because too heavy of a hand of government, and we're going to cut off our own innovation.
Sure. You mentioned Congress a moment ago, and I know there's this saying, politics ends at the water's edge. Yet, when there were efforts to secure aid for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, it became delayed. It was delayed many months. It became very partisan, and at one point, there was criticism leveled that the Republicans can only pass this with Democratic support. Well, when it comes to foreign policy, shouldn't it be bipartisan?
It should absolutely be bipartisan. And, Madison once said that politics is constant contestation.
Right.
He didn't say it was warfare, all right? And so very often you would find Ronald Reagan crossing the aisle, the famous Tip O'Neill friendship and so forth. And in foreign and defense policy, when you think about some of the leaders in the Senate particularly, they were on both sides of the aisle. So it was John McCain, and it was Sam Nunn, and
Yes.
it was Joe Biden, and it was John Warner. And together, they were able to steer a course where we could do the things that we need to do in a steady way. All that people really want from the United States is steadiness. I've often said, you've heard me say this, the only thing that our allies hate more than unilateral American leadership is no American leadership. They do understand that without American leadership, this will be an unfriendly world. But if we're constantly kind of zigging and zagging, it's very difficult for them to have confidence in us. I'm glad we finally got the package. I give a lot of credit to Mike Johnson for managing to do that. He also faced down those who would have taken him out because he did do what was right for the country. We need to have more of that, particularly when it comes to foreign policy.
Yes. Speaking of dealing with our allies, George Shultz had a great line that maintaining alliances requires good gardening.
Yes.
Do you think we're doing enough good gardening now?
We need to garden more, all right? I think George's metaphor was weeds will grow up if you don't garden, and so we need to do more. And we need to do more, not just in Europe and in Asia. I actually think we're doing a reasonable job, both in the Trump administration and now in the Biden administration, of working with our allies in the Indo-Pacific, partly because they see the rise of China. And so we've never been closer to Japan. We've never been closer to the Philippines. We've never been closer to South Korea. We have countries like Vietnam trying to get American bases, but it's a daily kind of thing. And if Mr. Putin thought that he was going to weaken Europe and NATO, surprise, who would have ever thought that we now have an Arctic flank thanks to Sweden
Right.
and Finland? So those alliances are good. I think we need to do more with allies in other places. Latin America is our neighborhood, and it sometimes gets ignored because it doesn't make trouble. Mexico has just had a presidential election. None of us knows what that portends, but these are relationships that I think you really do have to garden and garden frequently. We have friends in Africa. There are fewer presidents for life in Africa. We need to work on those relationships. And then come to the Middle East, we really need to garden in the Middle East because one of my great disagreements currently with this administration is I don't know why we keep looking for moderates in Iran. They aren't there. And the more that we look for moderates in Iran, the more we push bad buttons with our Gulf Arab allies in places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and not to mention Israel. And so I think the gardening is to be clear that we understand that our interests and their interests are being abridged by Iran, and that we're going to do everything we can to put pressure on that regime. And putting pressure on them doesn't mean unfreezing $6 billion, for instance. That would not be putting pressure on them.
Right. Yesterday, we had a lot of conversations about the 20th anniversary of President Reagan's passing, and of course you were at the National Cathedral for the state funeral, and also there were some of his allies on the world stage. Margaret Thatcher and her daughter Carol is here, and Brian Mulroney and his son Ben are here, and Yasuhiro Nakasone, and a number who were his allies, but also someone who was his adversary was there, Mikhail Gorbachev. And they had genuinely grown to respect each other and like each other. And I wonder, just looking back, how much you feel President Reagan's personality and character played in his success in leading our foreign policy.
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind that that Reagan's character, his bedrock belief in our values, his understanding of the essence of America, that's something I think we often don't value enough. When I listen to presidential debates sometimes, it's, and on day one I will. No, on day one you won't. Because, you know, turning the ship of state around is not so easy.
Right.
So what I want to hear is, do you know the essence of who we are? And Ronald Reagan understood the essence of who we are, and he could then translate that into a reason for American influence, American power. He was also just very resolute and tough, and you have to be. You know, the stories about the famous Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, when the Soviet Union had tried under repeated leaders to basically get us not to deploy Pershing II in response to their missile deployments. And they really helped to stir up a lot of protests, 1 million people in the streets of Europe, women chaining themselves to the fences of American military bases. We tend to forget how really terrible it was between sort of 1979 and 1981-82. And was told by George Shultz that at one point somebody said to Reagan, who had said that the zero option, meaning we'll only remove if you remove. And somebody said to Reagan, well, would you be willing to take, you know, some percentage? And Reagan said, what about zero? Do you not understand? And what about zero? Do the Soviets not understand? Right? And so that kind of resoluteness, but then the willingness to be open to new information and new opportunities. And so I will never forget the pictures of Reagan's visits to Moscow. But they had come after he had properly diagnosed what the Soviet Union was and why it was failing. I think he, you know, that I remember I was a young faculty member, and, you know, I was an academic, and hearing an American president talk about an evil empire, I thought, whoa, that's a little heavy-handed for an American president. But he was right, and he called it what it was. And then, when Gorbachev comes along and wants to try to change that, he was open and he respected that. So it was a rare combination of toughness on the one hand and openness to change on the other.
You mentioned in talking about the key dates, 9/11, and you were our national security advisor when 9/11 took place. And at that moment, unlike we'd seen for many years, there was this great sense of national unity and pride. And I think many of us remember the scene of members of Congress holding hands in front of the Capitol singing, "God Bless America." Do you sense if there was something like that today that we would have a similar reaction, or do you think the nation is too divided?
Well, I would like to think that you would get the reaction, but if I look at the way we reacted to the pandemic, it was not with grace. It was not with a, but therefore the grace of God go I. There was a lot of finger pointing and judgment and things that I think are not becoming of American citizenry. And I've asked myself, why was that the case? Not in every case. I mean, there were people who helped and people who tried to help. But if you think about, you know, well, if you don't wear a mask, or if you do wear a mask, or if you don't close your schools, or if you do close your schools, we were almost at war with one another at the worst possible time. But I have faith in us as a people, and I think that patriotic gene is still there. That respect for our fellow citizens. You know, we have something quite remarkable in the United States, and de Tocqueville talked about it in 1835 when he came here to see who these Americans were. And he talked about these voluntary associations that they'd get themselves into just to do good. Now, that was really rare in 1835. It was still rare in 1935. And in 2024, it's still pretty rare around the world. And so the idea that citizens helping citizens, individual citizens helping other citizens, is the highest form of democracy, not what the government necessarily does, but what we do for each other. I still think that spirit is there, and you see it in Boys and Girls Clubs and American Red Cross and Rotary Clubs, and so maybe that's where it resides. There's a lot that tries to tear us apart. We get our information in little silos. I tell my students all the time, if you find yourself constantly in the company of people who say amen to everything you say, find other company. Mm-hmm. Because just because you think it is so, doesn't make it so. And so as a people, we've become less open to debating ideas and more likely to just yell at one another. But I still think that spirit shows itself on an almost daily basis as citizens try to help each other.
Great. Now I have to be very diplomatic in asking this question.
Oops. Okay, I'm ready.
It occurs to me that you are now exactly the same age that Ronald Reagan was when he was elected President of the United States.
That's scary.
Now, I don't want to get in trouble with you, Condi, in asking the wrong question, but is there another job, either inside or outside of government, that you might be interested in having?
Thank you. Doug won't be writing about me, all right? So I learned a long time ago, it is not in my DNA to run for office. And, you know, we say, well, the wrong people are running for office. No, actually, God love anybody who wants to run for office, because what we put them through and what we say about them and the way we treat them as if somehow they're just there for self-aggrandizement, it's a wonder anybody wants to run for office. I also think that one day they're going to open up people who run for office and they're going to find they have some extra chromosome or something, because they are different. They gain kind of an energy from being out there. I would go out with George W. Bush, and we'd have 5 events in a day, and by the time we'd finish the 5th one, he's raring to go to the 6th, and I just want to go back to the hotel. You know, I'm just drained. And so they do have something special. I also love policy, not politics. And I really do believe that my calling now is with this next generation. I just, before I came here, we have a Hoover Fellowship for undergraduates at Stanford, and I just came from their final presentations. Right. And they were on everything from the rise of Putinism and understanding Putinism to a wonderful presentation on how to think about what is a good American citizen, to presentations on Taiwan. But they were doing what I hope we can get our students to do, which is to really try to understand an issue. I say to my students very often, you know, they are, by the way, the most public-minded kids I've taught.
That's good to hear.
I've taught for 40 years. They hired me when I was 12. No, I've taught for 40 years. They're the most public-minded, but they're in a hurry. And you have to say to them, all right, before you try to solve that problem, how about we try to understand that problem? You have to say to them, just because you Googled it doesn't mean you've researched it, right? And you have to say to them, my favorite line, I want to be a leader. Well, let's slow down. That's actually not a job description. So if we can get them, and universities are at fault here, if we are able to get them to the place that we're not telling them what to think, we're teaching them how to think. We're teaching them how to think deeply. We're teaching them that history is complex. History, we're teaching history these days. There are oppressors and oppressed, colonizers and colonized. And so if you happen to get caught in the oppressed category, then everything on the oppressor category must be bad and the oppressed must be good. And so if we can walk away from some of the harm that we're doing to them, I think they're going to be quite something, and I think that's really my calling these days.
As they say, we hope you'll keep your options open. When you were Secretary of State, you were America's top diplomat. You traveled the world. You forged close relationships with a number of world leaders. Are there some that stood out to you as more formidable and ones that maybe you continue to engage with?
Yes. Well, I continue to engage with Tony Blair. You know, we often said, if the Brits aren't with you, you're really by yourself. There really is something called a special relationship there, and so I continue to engage with the Brits. I was just with Rishi Sunak not too long ago. He is a graduate of the Stanford Graduate School of Business, so has some good Stanford ties. Probably the most formidable leader that I met was Nelson Mandela. And it was because there was something extraordinary about somebody who spent 27 years in jail and came out not saying, okay, now that blacks can oppress whites, that's what we're going to do, but said we're going to build a multi-ethnic South Africa where everybody can be a part. That takes vision, and that takes the willingness to forgive. That is just extraordinary. And you mentioned that I'm a golfer. And Ernie Els, the great South African golfer, said once, a white South African golfer, probably of Afrikaans background, and he said, when Mandela died, I felt as if my own father had died. And I thought, what a statement about this man and what he meant. Now, sadly, South Africa's gone off the rails, but I have to say he was somebody that I was very impressed with. And then President Bush liked, and I agreed with him, people who were struggling but were trying their very best. And a leader who doesn't get enough credit is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the president of Liberia after 25 years of civil war. And she was kind of like a school marm, you know, she was just sort of going to take her country by the ear if necessary and pull it along. But I will never forget, Laura Bush and I went to her inauguration. She was the first woman elected president in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're all sitting there and all the African leaders are there. A few of them democratically elected, a lot of them kind of, you know, presidents for life. And they're all cheering everything she says. And then she says, and tomorrow morning, all of my ministers and I personally will put our financial statements, our personal financial statements, on the internet so everybody can see them. Now there's silence. Like, are you kidding me? You're going to do what? And she was like that. She was really a breath of fresh air in Africa. So I was lucky. I got to meet a lot of those people. And I'll just give you one final one that may surprise you a little bit. Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon, first of all, he was a little tank driver, right? He was as wide as he was tall. He was also somebody who oddly spoke English better than he understood it. So what do I mean? You would say something, he would say something to you, you would say something, and you realized he just learned a bunch of phrases, and so he would sort of just put them together even if it didn't make sense. But not too long before he had his stroke in January of 2006, I was at his farm. And he was giving me a hard time about being a city girl who didn't know what the sheep were, and he knew every sheep by name. And he said, don't you know that thing about shepherds know their sheep by name? And I said, yes, sir, I'm a Presbyterian minister's daughter, know that. And, but he said, we have to look to the future. And he said, in a famous speech, Palestinians need to govern themselves. And he had the authority as somebody who had built the state of Israel to do it. Unfortunately, he had the stroke. Palestinians weren't ready. They've missed many opportunities to have their state, sadly. But Ariel Sharon was an extraordinary man, and I think he doesn't get enough credit for what he might have done.
You mentioned, of course, President Bush, and I know there's something that a number of us would love to hear you, a story that we'd love to hear you tell, and that is when you and he did the secret trip to Iran with baseball caps.
Iraq.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Iraq. Iraq with the baseball caps and
Yes.
hiding in the backseat of the car.
Yeah.
Can you tell us how that came together?
Well, this was in November of 2003, so Saddam Hussein had only recently been overthrown. It was obviously very dangerous, but the president wanted to go and have Thanksgiving dinner with the troops. And so the Secret Service had planned it that nobody would know. So we went out to the ranch for Thanksgiving. And then on that Wednesday night, we got into an unmarked van, the president and me. We had on baseball caps, unmarked Secret Service cars and the like, and we go, the only person who knew we were going was Laura. Nobody else knew, not even the girls knew. And so because we're in an unmarked car with no lights, however, we get and we hit traffic. And President Bush says to me, "What's that?" I said, "Sir, it's called traffic. I know you haven't had it for a while." And so we managed to get to the Crawford, to the Waco airport. We get to the airport and the guard says, "I have to see who's in the back of the car." Secret Service by this time is going crazy. So we just kind of blast through this poor guy and we get on Air Force One. But the part of this that's really quite, we go to Washington to pick up Air Force One. The part of it that's really still gives me chills is that because we were flying into what was still a war zone, Mark, who was the pilot of Air Force One, had to spiral the plane down. Corkscrew it down so that we wouldn't be hit with a shoulder-fired missile of some kind. And just before he started this, he told us that he was going to turn off all the lights in the plane. And can you imagine the kind of eeriness of all the lights are off? You can just see those little blue halogen lights. And I said to Andy Card and Dan Bartlett, maybe we should go pray with the president. So we did, but it was extraordinary. And then we landed, we had dinner with the troops, we got back on the plane, and then it was announced that we had been in Baghdad.
After you'd taken off?
After we'd taken off. And there were 4 journalists with us who knew. But of course, since their security was also at stake, they didn't have any desire to tell anybody either. So it worked. But the president later said, "Yeah, we kind of look like a couple going to Walmart for..."
Well, Connie, when we have someone with great expertise here, we always like to get your insights and your perspective on things. So I would like to ask you, which teams do you feel did best in the NFL draft? Apart from the Denver Broncos.
The Denver Broncos? What do you mean apart from the Denver Broncos? Well, you know, I'm a huge football fan. Okay, so those of you who don't know, my father was a football coach when I was born. I was supposed to be his All-American linebacker. He decided, oh, well, he had a girl, he'd just teach her instead. So I actually think that I liked what the Houston Texans did. D'Amico Ryans is a really great young coach, and I liked what the Texans did in this draft. I like what the Jets did too, but I don't know if Aaron Rodgers is, you know, he's 40 years old. That's old for a quarterback. But I do have to tell you that football is my favorite sport, but hockey is my second favorite sport to the Mulroneys. I'm a San Jose Sharks fan normally, but they're so bad that I've adopted the Colorado Avalanche. But I'm going to say something in the Ronald Reagan Library that is perhaps a little un-American. I'm pulling for the Edmonton Oilers because the Cup has to go back to Canada. Since 1993, the Cup has not been in Canada. It should go back to Canada.
Well, we have a few minutes for questions from our audience. Condi, if
Yes.
you're available, we've got microphones. Looks like Ben Sutton has his hand up over there.
And feel free. I teach 19-year-olds. Nothing I haven't been asked. So.
So I'm going to continue on the football front. Those of us, you know, as you know, I have been in the college sports world my whole career. There are a lot of us in this space that think that it would be great to have a great policy leader as the commissioner of college football. It's not an elected position, so therefore not that political. Any thoughts on the current state of college football?
Yeah, let me just say that I'm worried about the state of college intercollegiate athletics in general. I think we are in danger of seeing a separation of the student from the athlete. The proposition really should be that you go to college because you do want to play your sport at the highest level. Your folks did, your kids did, ours do. But there's also this thing called a college degree that you're going to get. And oh, by the way, so I did a basketball commission for the NCAA. 59% of D1 basketball players thought they were going to the NBA. 59%. The real number is 1.5%. You need a plan B. And so these kids need to be encouraged to get a degree. I think football is separating from the rest, and that's going to be a problem because football is the only sport that makes money, and it funds women's tennis and men's golf and swimming and all of those things, and not to mention the Olympic sports. People really don't realize which university is kind of the farm team for the U.S. Olympic team. And so I'm worried about it. We're going to have some rulings coming down soon about athletes. Let me just put it this way. Name it, where they make a commercial or something. I have no problem with that. They should be able to do that. But I really do hope we can somehow reaffirm that these are students first. We would be losing something very valuable if we did. And right now, you may want to know, I'm actually special representative of the Stanford president for athletics, because I don't know if you know this, but Stanford is going to the Atlantic Coast Conference next year along with Cal Berkeley. Yes, our geography is not confused. We know we're not on the Atlantic Coast, but the Pac-12 has collapsed, and Colorado wasn't on the Pacific Coast either. And so we're going to do that. And so I've been working on athletics the last year or so.
Another question? There's way over there.
Hi, Secretary Rice. My name's London, and I'm an undergrad student at Pepperdine, and I'm so glad that you see a future with us, college students. Is there any advice that you want to give us?
Yes, sure. Well, I was at Pepperdine not too long ago, actually. You have a really fine school there and a lot of great things going on there. I would say, first and foremost, try to find what you really are passionate about while you're in college. What's the specific combination of your skills and what you love that is going to sustain you for the rest of your life? And sometimes when young people go to college, they say, I know what I want to be. And a few do. I knew what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a great concert pianist. It turned out that that wasn't the exact alignment of skills and interest, and so I found something else. So give yourself a little bit of time, explore. Don't be just so determined to figure out what you want to do. Figure out what you want to be first. And for me, it turned out I wanted to be somebody who did things international, who knew Russia and the like. So that's the first. The second is, don't be afraid to try something hard. Our students these days are so worried about the transcript that you fail to take things that are hard for you. And I think you will find that you can be more fulfilled by doing things that are hard than by just continuing to do things that are easy. So if you're really good at math, write more. If you're really good at writing, take more math. The third is the point that I made earlier, take your time. I think anybody in this room, of whatever age, would tell you that college goes by in a flash. And if you can recognize that you're going to have many episodes to your life, and you don't have to have a plan for when you're 45, you'll be open to different opportunities as they come along. And the final point I'd make is, try not just to stay with your tribe. Try to be and introduce yourself to people who are different, people who come from different backgrounds, who think differently, and try to engage them. And the best way to engage people who are different is to resist the temptation to constantly transmit and to actually listen once in a while to what other people are saying. And those will all be very fulfilling. But congratulations, Pepperdine's a great place. I'm sure you're going to do very well.
Carol Thatcher.
Yes, Carol Thatcher, yes.
Secretary, more sport, I'm afraid. As a crack golfer yourself, do you have a view on how the Liv PGA chaos should be sorted?
Yes. Thank you. Yes, it is politics, actually, yes. So I have an outcome that I would like. I would like these to be back together. I was at the Masters, obviously. I want to see DJ play. I want to see Brooks Koepka play. I also want to see Scottie Scheffler play, and I want to see Max Homa play. And the game is better when all the best golfers are playing together. And I don't know what the answer is going to be for how they do it. I know there's a lot of water under the bridge. I know there are ill feelings on both sides. You took the money, you didn't understand. Oh, now you're making a deal with Saudi Arabia. I know there's a lot of that. But I really think if you could get two people in a room and say, solve this, that it's not beyond to figure out how to get these two groups back together. And it would also help in other ways too. I think that there are those who fear that the women's game could start to splinter, and that would also be a very bad thing. So I don't have a good answer for, if I were trying to negotiate it, I'm not sure what I would put as the terms, but I do think that these two have got to come back together. This is not sustainable to have them separated this way.
We have a question from Ben Mulroney.
Yes. Ben,
yes, thank you, Madam Secretary, for what you said about hockey. I was at that game in 1993 when the Canadians last won the Cup, so it'd be very nice to have it north of the border. Again, also, I got into Pepperdine Law School, and I took a trip to that campus and realized in about 3 seconds I would fail out of that school because it's so beautiful.
It is beautiful.
But Madam Secretary, yesterday we had a panel where we were given the broad strokes of Ronald Reagan's policy towards the Soviet Union. For step one, call them out for what they are. Step two, isolate them and marginalize them from obtaining credit in financial institutions around the world. Step three, drive up the price of oil. Step four, celebrate, more or less. And today we had another panel where an analogy was traced between the world that he inherited in 1981 and the world that we face today. The biggest dissimilarity that I see is sort of how interconnected we are to China versus how isolated Russia was. So how does that factor into how we should be approaching China in the future?
Yes, absolutely. And you're right, it is, that is the major difference. It's hard to untangle. And I don't think we will be able to completely untangle it. I think that we are decoupling on technology. We are. We woke up one day and said, oh, and by the way, one of the dumbest speeches any leader possibly could have given was Xi Jinping's, we will surpass the United States in AI and quantum computing by 2030. What did he think was going to happen? We looked around and said, wait a minute, you mean that our supply chain for chips is in a place called Taiwan? Isn't that vulnerable? We looked around and said, what do you mean that rare earth minerals are all controlled by China? And so slowly but surely, and oh, by the way, the civil military fusion, so you're going to take the technology that we help to fund through our venture capitalists, and you're going to hand it to the PLA so that they can expel us from the Indo-Pacific? We're off that train. So we have decoupled. But there are going to be other areas in which we will continue to have commercial relations, and I think it's not a bad thing. One of the ones that's kind of interesting is that the Chinese are really very into American entertainment, all those only children, right? And so when, you may remember when the Houston Rockets general manager said something about Hong Kong, and the Chinese threatened to kick the NBA out. And I talked to Adam Silver. I said, they're not going to kick you out because those young princelings are not going to watch the Chinese national team play the Kazakh national team. Right? They want to see LeBron and they want to see Steph. And so there are some places. I would stay open to Chinese students because I do believe that we have an effect on people who come here and get to know us. But on some places, we're going to have to recognize the peace through strength doctrine. And that means that we have to be absolutely clear that we are in a position to help Taiwan defend itself if necessary, that we are going to continue to do freedom of navigation exercises, that we are worrying about bumping up against the Chinese in various places, and so we're going to support the Philippines and support Vietnam. We're going to continue the Quad with India and Japan and Australia. We're going to leverage the fact that we have the strongest allies. So we can do both. We can continue to do the things with China that make sense, that the integration has brought about, but we're going to have to toughen our stance on resisting their efforts to build an alternative system to the US system. And I think Reagan would have been very good at doing that because he knew how to simultaneously treat the Soviet Union as the evil empire that it was, and as I said, be open to possibilities for cooperation when necessary.
We have a question back there.
Obviously, there is an election coming up this year. What I wanted to know is there's a lot of noise right now. What do you think is missing from the conversation?
Yeah.
What is the thing that you think that just nobody's talking about that's going over everybody's head that we need to focus on?
Yeah, I think what's missing from the conversation is policy. You know, it's really kind of unfortunate. You know, everybody's got their slogans and their appeals to base and all of that. But as I said, you know, I've never been one in presidential debates or presidential elections for the most detailed policy proposal that you can put forward, because it really is true when you finally go up there and you raise your hand and you get your inauguration's over and you go and sit at the Oval Office desk for the first time and you realize there's really not that much that's going to change immediately. I've seen that look on presidents' faces like, oh, this is what it's like. But we ought to have a really important discussion about a couple of things. One is our role in the world. And I really want to say to people who want to lead us, when Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are on their victory tour, because somehow we didn't support Ukraine, and they ended up then defeating NATO, because that's how it will be read, I want you to stand up and tell the American people you could have stopped that, but you couldn't get $61 billion for assistance to Ukraine. And that's not going to be a pretty moment, Mr. President. So why don't we talk about how you really view America's role in the world? Secondly, I do understand why in certain parts of our country, people are feeling as if globalization left them behind. When I teach at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, I will have a student with the following profile. Born in Brazil, went to college at Oxford, first job was in Dubai, now is in school at Stanford, next job will be in Shanghai, moves easily around the world. Most people never move 25 miles from where they were born. Their possibilities are different, their aspirations are different. And for the unemployed coal miner in West Virginia with his opioid-addicted wife, we don't have anything to say to them. And so I want to know what you're going to do to make sure that the America that I have benefited from and that I know is available to all Americans if they're willing to work hard for it. What's your idea about how to do that? And we might get some very interesting answers, because for some, on one side, it might be all about what the government can do to do that. On the other, it might be all about what private companies have to do. And somewhere in there is a proper role for what the government might do and a proper role for what the private sector might do. That may not surprise you. I think 90% of it's the private sector. But I'd like to hear that debate, because people are talking over, you know, when you say things like, the economy's just fine, and people can't afford their groceries, they think you've lost your mind. And so, because I think Ronald Reagan never lost touch with, let's call it, the common person, he could speak to both that person who is in my class at Stanford and the person who just wanted a leg up. I want to have that conversation. And then finally, I have a kind of personal one that I want to ask. So are you for school choice or not? Right? So, and here's why I want to ask you that. We already have a choice system in education. If you are of means, you will move to a district where the schools are good and the houses are expensive, like Palo Alto, California. If you go across the street from Stanford, Palo Alto High has a performance arts center that looks like a smaller version of Stanford's. If you're really wealthy, you will send your kids to private schools. So who's stuck in failing neighborhood schools? Poor kids. A lot of them minority kids. So how can you say you're for civil rights? How can you say you're for the poor when you're condemning those children to not being able to read? By the time they're in 3rd grade, they're never going to read. So if you want to say that school choice and vouchers and charter schools are destroying the public schools, fine. You write that editorial in the Washington Post, but then don't send your kids to Sidwell Friends, right? So that's the final question I would like to ask.
Well, I think that's just a perfect note to conclude this conversation. Condi, thank you very much for spending time with us this afternoon.
Thank you, and thank you for all being here.